In the previous lectures, you learned about add_for and add_if. Now, this syntax is relatively new though. It was only added with Angular version 17. Earlier versions of Angular don't support this syntax. And of course, it's possible that you're working on a project that's using such an older Angular version. In that case, there is an alternative syntax, which used to be the standard before the introduction of add_for and add_if. And that syntax would look like this. You would add asterisk ng4 on the element that should be repeated, and then add an equal sign, and between the quotes have this code here for repeating the element. Though you would have to add the keyword let in front of this user variable. Now this ng4 thing here is a so-called structural directive. Now, structural directives are in the end enhancements, you could say, that you can add to elements that will change those elements or change the DOM where those elements are used. And we'll dive deeper into directives and how you can build your own directives later in a dedicated course section. In order to use this ng4 structural directive here, you have to go to the component class of the component where you want to use it in the template and add it here to the imports array. For that, you first of all have to import it. You have to import ng4, written like this, from @angular/common, so not from core, but from common, and then add it here to this imports array. This is how you unlock this structural directive for use in the template. And it's similar for if. Instead of using add_if, so I'll comment this out, you would add asterisk ngIf on the element that should be shown conditionally, and then put your condition between those quotes. So for example, selected user, like this. Now in this case, TypeScript actually doesn't understand that here selected user will be set, and hence I would need to add an exclamation mark here to convince it that this is the case. For showing the else case, you would have to go for a more complex syntax where you add a special element, the ng template element, which is an element provided out of the box by Angular, and you would wrap that around your else content, and then go back to ngIf, add a semicolon, and then add the else keyword, and then give this ng template here an identifier by adding hashtag fallback or anything like this. The name after the hashtag is up to you. And then you refer to that name here after else. So that's how this else content here is displayed. Now, just like ng4, ngIf must be unlocked first before you can use it. So you also have to import ngIf and then add it here to this imports array. And with that done, if you now reload, you got the same behavior as before, but now in a way that also works in older Angular versions with ng4 and ngIf. Now, of course, this course here is about teaching you the recent Angular versions, and hence I'll not use ng4 and ngIf. Also because, as you can tell, this approach is more verbose, especially here with ngIf and this else block, but also with all those extra imports that are needed. Therefore, I'll get rid of those imports here, and also of these imports at the top. And I'll get rid of the ngIf directive and this fallback wrapper ng template here. And I'll bring back add_if instead, and this else block like this. And do the same for ng4. Delete it here on the element, and instead bring back add_for, and now also get rid of this exclamation mark down here again, because now we don't need it anymore. because this is the recommended way of outputting list or conditional content. But since you might be working on an Angular project that uses an older version of Angular, or you simply might stumble across ng-for or ng-if on existing projects, it is of course important to also understand how those directives work and how you could use them for outputting list or conditional content. So slowly but steadily, this application is taking shape, but of course, if we select a user, we at the moment only see their name. And that's what will change now. For that, we can go to that tasks component, and in there, instead of just outputting their name like this, I now want to add a bit more markup and content. For example, for styling purposes, I want to add a section with an ID of tasks. And in that section, I want to add a header element, so the standard built-in header element, and move this h2 element into this header. And I also don't just want to output the name of the user, but instead name, then single quote s tasks, so that this will say Emily's tasks, and so on. Now below this h2 element, I'll add a menu which contains one button which will later allow us to add a new task. Hence it has a caption of add task. Later we'll add a click listener and do something when it's clicked, but for now we'll just leave it like this. And then below this header, the idea is to output an unordered list of tasks. So of the tasks that have been assigned to a user. And for that, we'll soon build a dedicated custom component, which will be output as a list item in that list. That's the idea here. Now with that change made, if we select a user, this looks like this, which is not too great. The reason for that is that we currently got no styles for this component yet. And that's why attached you find a prepared tasks.component CSS file, which does include some styles for this component. Now we already are linking to that file here in the tasks component TypeScript file, and therefore those styles will be included. And if you reload, this now looks much better. So that's the first step. The next step now is to output some tasks for our users here. Now, in order to output multiple tasks here, I want to create a new reusable task component. So a component that outputs an individual task. And we can do this with help of the Angular CLI again. And you can, of course, absolutely also try this on your own first as a little exercise. That you create a new task component and you then output a list of such tasks inside of this tasks component here. The task component, so the component for an individual task, can simply output some dummy data for now. I'll create this new component now by again using the Angular CLI to generate a new component. And I want to generate this new component in the tasks folder. And this is how you can do this with the CLI. You define the path to the component that should be added. Tasks / and then the name of the new component, task in this case. Again, I need no automated tests, so I'll add -- skip tests. And with that, this task folder here is created. In there, for the moment, we can simply output a task or something like this. And then in the tasks component HTML file, we can use that here in the list. Use the newly added app task component. Of course, as always, in order to use it here, it must first be unlocked. So we can auto import it into the tasks component so that it's added to imports there. And with that done, it will be output here. And now we could output multiple tasks here like this. we can't use at4 yet because we don't really have any list data that would allow us to output multiple tasks. That will change soon, but for the moment, we can simply output it like this. With that, if you reload, you will see some tasks here. Now, I want to improve the styling and also the markup of this task component here. And therefore, attached, you find a task.component.css file, which contains some styles you should place in your task component CSS file. And back in the task component template file, so in this task component HTML file, I will now add an article, and in there have my h2 element, which will later output the task title once we have some dynamic task data. Then below that, some time, which will also be added in the future. Then a summary of the task. And then another paragraph with a class of actions where I want to have a button that will allow me to mark a task as completed. Again, we'll add some real data later, of course. With that done, if we now select the user, we see these task items here, which arguably look better than what we had before. But of course, now it would be nice to have some real task data that would be output here, instead of having this dummy fallback content.